Welcome, everybody. Excited to have you in class today. What a fantastic topic. We get to look through and explore in this class the principles of the American Revolution, one of my favorite classes that the Constitution Center teaches every year. My name is Curry Sotner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer. I'm here to help you ask questions, share ideas, and also torture Tom Donnelly, one of our top scholars here at the center. Tom, would you like to introduce yourself to everybody?
Hi, I'm Tom. Thanks so much for being here. Can't wait to talk about the principles of the American Revolution.
Awesome, Tom. And we love lots of questions, so keep them coming as we go. So, Tom, there's a lot to go through in this class because we're not just looking at the classic, this battle happened, then this happened next, 1, 2, 3. We're really starting with the big ideas that framed the founding generation and how they not only came up with the idea to have a revolution, but how they proved their argument of how they can pick a fight with the largest superpower at the time, the British Empire, and win on legal grounds, win on moral grounds, and win to get people energized about what a big change this is going to be. So I love these three big principles we start with, and it always makes me feel like this is a kind of a big bang moment for democracy in the world before the Constitution and energizing people about theory behind the practice. So there's always so many questions that we have going through, but can you give us that, that 3-pillar structure that we're basing the revolution on so we can understand how it fits into the documents and the words and the country that we begin to develop?
Absolutely, Curry. Yeah, so we're going to move from big principles and then try to see how they played out during the American Revolution. Because what we're talking about here is this amazing 15-year period where the American colonists went from loyal British subjects in 1760 to open revolution in 1775 and the Declaration in 1776. And these are the 3 big principles that help drive that. The 3 principles are natural rights, popular sovereignty, and the rule of law. So before we drill down into each, let's begin with some simple definitions to make sure we're all on the same page. And you know what? Let's start with popular sovereignty, Curry, because that's in a way the root of it all. And this is the idea that the most legitimate form of government is a government driven by us, not by a king, not by the aristocracy, not by the nobility, but by us, the people themselves. So that's popular sovereignty. The second big idea is natural rights. And natural rights are rights that are given by God or nature. They don't come from government. These are rights that you get just for being a human being, just for being born, and they're rights that you can't give up to the government. So that's popular sovereignty, natural rights. The last big idea is the rule of law. And the rule of law is the idea that we have a government of laws, not a government by man or by arbitrary rule. The big principle here is that no one is above the law. So let's start, Curry. Let's start with popular sovereignty, say a little bit more about that and about each of these 3, and then we can get to the revolution. So starting with popular sovereignty, the big principle here again is that the ultimate authority of government comes from the people. And where do we see this? Well, the most famous spot is in the US Constitution. It's those opening words, "We the people." And here the idea is that power and authority, it's not resting with the government itself, but with the people themselves. And so if we look at even the Constitution we have today, we look at the president, the Congress, the courts, they are limited by this principle. They aren't our boss, we are their boss. And the principle of popular sovereignty ends up being the engine of so much of American constitutional history, from the founding all the way up through today. Because the big idea that organizes popular sovereignty is the idea that with authority coming from the people then have the power to change or get rid of their government if it's not serving them. And this can lead to really big changes. We're going to talk today about a revolution. It could lead to a revolution. It can lead to a new framework of government like the US Constitution. But over time, it could also lead to smaller scale changes like constitutional amendments or new laws. So Curry, that's popular sovereignty. I'll pause there for a moment.
And I love that. I think that is so important to think of those 2 ways that you described it. It's the government is powered by us, and the change in that government can come from us, be it revolution or amending the Constitution. Big ideas wrapped into popular sovereignty. Now, natural rights, and Gloria asked this question about natural rights. So as you go in to define it, kind of unpack this for it. How can nature give rights if it doesn't, it's inanimate? How can it actually give rights? So dive into what natural rights really is and what does that mean that you can have them by God or by nature?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, just beginning again with the big definitions. The big definition. So natural rights, again, they're rights coming from nature, from God, not from government. And I mean, I think that by God and nature, what we're thinking about here is the old thought experiment of human beings existing in a state of nature before they create a government. And so this is the great thought experiment by political theorists like John Locke, trying to explain, what rights did we have when we had no government, and then explain why is it, after all, when we were so free then, that we would set up a government in the first place. And so he used natural rights as a way of understanding the set of rights that we had in nature, and then furthermore, those set of rights that we could never give up to government. There are sort of two sets of rights in this idea. One is the idea of an alienable right. So these are rights that in the state of nature, as we're setting up a government, we can give up to the government. These are powers that we can give up to the government. This is a bargain that we're striking with the government. And so the classic example is something like the right to self-protection, the right to self-defense, the right to punish. So in a political society, I can give away this right to the government, and then the government takes on the obligation of keeping me safe. So I can't take the law into my own hands. Once I have this government, I can't go, violently strike back against people who I think have wronged me. I've given up that power to the government, and that's the bargain. That's the bargain we make with the social contract. That's an alienable right. But then there's also a set of inalienable rights. Inalienable rights are rights, again, that we get just for being human beings, just for being born. We're born free and equal, in the words of the Declaration of Independence, which we'll get to very shortly. But the classic unalienable right is the right to conscience. Because my religious beliefs, or the fact that I have no religious beliefs, I don't believe in God, or a product of my reason, I'm not able to give them up. We have a right and duty to make up those decisions, those matters of conscience for ourselves, and it's something that we can't surrender to government. So Curry, that's a little bit about natural rights.
And I think that's so helpful. Like I always have this scenario. It's like a Sim City, but basically you're in the woods all by yourself and you're, collecting your friends. It's like whatever that TV show was, Survivor. It's like Survivor or Lord of the Flies, whatever, reference we want to this. But that's how I always think John Locke started, in that sense. And also inalienable rights, you can't alienate them, you separate them out from something else because they're a part of your existence. So I always think about, I can't take away my thoughts. My thoughts fly constantly out of my head. There is no way to control those.
No control.
Mindfulness maybe, but you cannot alienate them. But all this kind of is based off of a deal that you're making. Okay, we're going to build a government. I'll give you some of these rights, the ones I can give over, some I can never give over, but we're going to make a deal with each other and we're going to make a contract with each other to make that work. So can you just take one more beat on social contract theory? Just because I know a lot of our students have been engaging with this in the last year because it's been such a hot topic lately.
Yeah, I mean, so again, this is it's trying to explain how it is we get a government, and so it's a huge thought experiment, and we'll get into it a bit as we get to the revolution. But really, it's useful to think about it as a contract, both from the perspective of we begin with popular sovereignty. We the people have freedom. We the people have power, and that when we create government, we're creating an agreement, a contract with that government to do certain things for us. And again, the classic examples of this are our rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, our security. And once we have this contract, the government has to keep up its end of the bargain. If not, then again, rooted back in the idea of popular sovereignty, we can take the power back. We can have a revolution. We can, in a peaceful way, create a new government. There are a lot of ways to do it. But in the end, the most fundamental natural right of all, to a certain extent, is the right to alter or abolish your government, the right of revolution.
I love that. I feel like every, fifth grader in the world can get behind that. Now, but a lot of fifth graders also love rules and following rules and making sure that it's fair for everybody to know the rules. If you've ever listened to a bunch of fifth graders on the playground, you hear it. You're not following the rules. That's not fair. They are all about rule of law. Where does this idea of rule of law kind of genesis from? And then how do we understand what really is the agreement we make and say we will give it up, follow rule of law, and how do they have to be followed?
Yeah, so the rule of law is just that big idea that we're a government of laws, not of man or of arbitrary rule, and that no one's above the law. And this can be a bit of an abstract concept sometime to understand, but Justice Neil Gorsuch recently taught a class to the National Constitution Center, and I think he explained it really well. He brought up the example of the Roman Emperor Caligula, and this is sort of the classic example of when the rule of law is violated. So what did Caligula do? Caligula wrote the law in small print and posted it up so high that no one could ever read it and be sure of their legal responsibilities. And so the emperor can say, sure, I wrote the law down. I put it up there in public, but no one had access to it. No one knew how to comply with it. No one knew what the rules were. And so anyone could be punished for anything. It was up to the emperor and his whim. And so there's no process, no fairness, no equality, no requirement to follow reason. It's just the whims of one person. That's what we mean by arbitrary rule. And so, when we're thinking of what is the rule of law, what should law do from this perspective? Well, it needs to be knowable by the people. They have to know what the rules are. They have to be possible. It has to be possible for them to understand the rules, possible for them to follow the rules. And the rules have to treat people equally and fairly and provide advance notice of what's to be expected. And of course, most fundamental of all in a certain sense is that the rule of law is something that also binds government officials. Government officials, from the president to Congress to the courts to our state and local governments, they are also held accountable to the law themselves.
We asked our group of students this a couple weeks ago when we had a program at the center, and I love their example. So they said, rule of law. And we said, give us an example of rule of law. And the best answer I've ever heard was a stop sign. It's clear, it's in front of you. Everybody knows what it means. Everybody knows what you're supposed to do at it. And I was like, oh, this is like what the opposite of Caligula. Like, this is clear, this is direct, we all know what it means and know when to follow and when people aren't. So great kind of like spelling this out and giving us examples. Now, we talk all these ideas, and I always think of these three, popular sovereignty, rule of law, and natural rights as the three pillars that the argument of America is based on. And we laid out that argument in a beautiful document called the Declaration of Independence. So what are some of the pieces that we can see these pillars in the document?
Yeah, so of course the Declaration itself, it's Congress explaining to the world why we're declaring independence from the British Empire. And so a lot of the Declaration, it's a bunch of complaints about what King George III and the Empire has done. We'll get to those as we get into the Revolution. But in the opening lines that we all know so well and have read so often, we also see the key principles we just went through: popular sovereignty, natural rights, and the rule of law. And Curry, should we just sort of walk through at least a few of those opening passages just to see them, those ideas in action?
Go for it.
Perfect. So here, the most famous words, maybe other than we the people, in American history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Here we see a powerful vision of natural rights right at the beginning. We are all born free and equal. We get our rights from God. We get them just for being us, for being human, for being born. And these rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that's that first opening passage. And then we go into the next passage, which is that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. So we're explaining our theory of government here. It's a powerful vision of popular sovereignty tied to social contract theory. We give up certain rights. We give certain powers to the government, and the government agrees to protect us. And then finally, this next passage is so powerful, it brings all of the principles together. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So here we see the rule of law. In other words, we made an agreement with the government. The government agreed to keep us safe, to protect our lives, liberty, happiness. And again, we see popular sovereignty. The ultimate power here is lying with us, we the people. If the government breaks the agreement, we can take the power back. And then finally, we see natural rights. What's the most fundamental, unalienable right of all? It's the right of revolution, the right to alter or abolish a government that doesn't promote our safety and happiness. Those final two words you see there. It's the right to form a new government.
I think it's unbelievably powerful. And you can hear and see the theory, the brilliant argument, the fantastic writing, all of this power in these passages. But what kind of like blows my mind is just like 2 decades before they were like happy British subjects. How do we in like less than 20 years go from we're British to nope, we are breaking up with you with one of the biggest breakups of all time? So what happened? Like, how did this fall apart so quickly?
Yeah, it's 15 years, and it's an amazing 15 years. And so what we have here, King George III becomes king in 1760. And again, it's important to remember in 1760, the American colonists, they're thrilled by this. They love their new king. They love being British subjects. They value and love the British Constitution. They think the British people are the freest and most prosperous in the world, and that they themselves are as British as anyone living across on the other side of the Atlantic. So they love their association with the British Empire. On the other hand, Curry, if you were to ask the king, if you were to ask royal officials, if you ask Parliament, what do you think about the American colonists? They'd probably say, we don't really think very much about them at all. And so we have this interesting situation where for decades upon decades, the American colonists have largely been ignored by the British Empire. And as a result, they've really taken on a lot of the responsibilities of self-governance. It's a very democratic system that we find in a lot of the American colonies with very little meddling from the British Empire. Even the laws that are on the books say to attack things like smuggling. The British Empire largely doesn't enforce them. So we have, that's the British policy of salutary neglect. And so it raises a question, and this is what ends up driving us for the next 15 years. What's going to happen when the British Empire decides to do more? What happens when the British Empire decides we want to be more involved in American affairs? What happens when the British Empire says we have massive war debt, the Americans have a ton of money, they evade our taxes, we should start collecting some money from them? And so we see the friction grow from sort of the 1760 all the way into 1775 and 1776.
I know we're going to talk about the Navigation Acts and the Sugar Acts and all those pieces, and our students are asking really good questions because I'm going to weave them in at the end. But I know that one of your favorite stories and one of my favorite stories to listen to is around James Otis. So I think for this advanced class, can you dive into that story and give us a little bit of meat about how this kind of captures the moment? It's like a great case study of how these changes went into effect and why we see all these acts happening and the resistance and the escalation to a war.
Yeah, and the great friend of the Constitution Center, Akil Reed Amar, who's going to be here on Friday, says that really the colonists need 3 separate things to drive them to revolution. One is personal. They have to be willing to say, we're not British subjects anymore. And so that's a really big deal for them. The second is military. They have to believe they can actually win a fighting war against the British Empire, which may seem crazy in 1760, but they have to be able to believe that. And finally, there's a legal part of this, and this is where James Otis comes in, where so they need a constitutional theory to counter Parliament's push to raise taxes and shape policy in the American colonies. So this story of James Otis and the writs of assistance brings us back to 1761. So it's shortly after King George III becomes king. It's 15 years before the Declaration of Independence. We're in Boston. And so the British Empire has put in place these Navigation Acts that are meant to regulate trade within the empire. With this, it's meant to also crack down on illegal smuggling. And again, as I already said, the British Empire generally has pursued a policy of salutary neglect. So they've let basically smugglers do what they want. They haven't really enforced these laws. But the British Empire changes its policy because it needs money from the colonies. And the Americans, they have money, but they certainly don't want the British interfering in their affairs. And so King George III uses his royal officials in the colonies to crack down on tax evaders and colonial smugglers using what were called writs of assistance. So what were these? These were writs, so pieces of paper that gave royal officials, these are usually customs officials, free range to break into homes or ships of the colonists to search for evidence of smuggling. So they could do this anytime, anywhere, for any reason. And the colonists are outraged by this. They see this as treating them as second-class subjects of Great Britain and violating some of their most important rights. And so James Otis steps in. He's a prominent Boston lawyer and patriot. He takes on the smugglers' cause here in the writs of assistance case. And a lot of these smugglers, they're really local merchants, many prosperous people in Massachusetts in Boston. And the case finds its way to Massachusetts' highest court. And Otis makes this powerful argument. He argues that these writs violated the British Constitution, the English common law, and the colonists' natural rights. And so, one, the writs are violating this key principle that a man's house is his castle, and whilst he is quiet, he is as well guarded as a prince. Otis is appealing more broadly to the rights of man. But more importantly, what he's really doing is he's saying, look, you are not treating us as full British citizens. We have rights under the British Constitution that you're violating. Furthermore, we have natural rights as human beings that you are violating through these writs of assistance. And so he's asking the Massachusetts court to strike these writs of assistance down as effectively violating the British Constitution. And then finally, I love the way he explains this. So he's saying, so what is the real harm that's being done here? And he says the writs of assistance here, it is the power that places the liberty of every man in the hands of every petty officer. When that happens, the rule of law breaks down. Our rights are in the hands of every British citizen, every British officer, every little petty British official. It's not the king, it's these petty officials in the American colonies. And with that, all of the most fundamental things that we care about as British subjects really fall by the wayside.
And this is where you start to see that chipping away at the belief that the king is all powerful, that the king is the monarch, and that we're not being treated fairly and correct. I do also imagine when he is there saying this in the courtroom, there had to be cheers like after this moment. And what, we talked, it's the famous letter from John Adams. John Adams was there and was listening to this. And what is the great quote from John Adams?
He said, this was the first scene of the first act of opposition to the arbitrary claims of Great Britain. Then and there, the child of independence was born. And what he means by that is that James Otis is beginning to develop a deep constitutional theory of why the colonists need to be independent. In part, it's that the British are violating the social contract that's happening here, that they're violating the core rights of British subjects. And that when that happens, we need something like the Massachusetts court to step in and protect us. And if not, maybe we'll have to do more.
Amazing. So after this, we get, boom, boom, boom. So let's go through the acts and kind of look at the big issues that happen with each act. And then what does it lead us to? And then we'll get to, somebody's favorite revolutionary person, Thomas Paine.
Absolutely. So, so what we end up seeing, the writs of assistance, the James Otis, what's happening in the early 1760s there, it's often the British Empire trying to enforce old laws they had not enforced before. But then we see, beginning in 1764, a series of new acts, all designed effectively to raise money from the American colonists. The first one of these is the Sugar Act of 1764. It's charging taxes on imported molasses. And it's also setting up a new process to end illegal smuggling. So from the American colonist perspective, there are two things they're really concerned about here. And James Otis is actually an important theorist of the first part. One, taxes are being imposed here. And what the colonists are arguing is that this is violating a core principle of the British Constitution. No taxation without representation. Parliament here, they could say that they're doing this to regulate trade or whatever, which they do have a power to do. But instead, what we really know Parliament's doing, they're trying to squeeze us. They're trying to take money from us. They're trying to tax us. And we have no representation in Parliament. If they want to tax us, if they say they need our money, they should have to convince our elected representatives in the colonial assemblies. Only they really have the power to tax us. So no taxation without representation. The other part of this is that the Sugar Act is setting up what are called vice admiralty courts. And so this means as they're cracking down on American smugglers, what they're saying is that these cases are going to end up in court in front of judges with no colonial juries. And so for the American colonists who deeply value the jury as a bulwark of their liberty, they again see this as a key violation of the British Constitution.
Thank you for using bulwark. It's my favorite word. And we see it again in the drafts of Madison for the Bill of Rights. So it's a great word. You'll look at the colonial the state constitutions, and you'll see this word over and over again in the next coming years. So the Stamp Act is next, and the colonists aren't quiet about this, and they push back, and they're pushing back really hard.
Absolutely. So the Stamp Act is another new tax. It's placed on papers. And so if you have a diploma, a court filing, even a newspaper, you have to pay a tax to the British Empire to put an imperial stamp on it. And this new money would be used to help fund the British government. Also, it sets up a series of vice admiralty courts to enforce this act as well. And the colonists really fight back hard. So in Boston, there's massive mobbing. They destroy the would-be stamp collector's office, his house, and so ultimately he doesn't take the job, probably a wise decision. They also ransack the house of Governor Thomas Hutchinson. 8 other colonies also join the fight. And what's their argument? What are their arguments? The same ones we saw with the Sugar Act, which is no taxation without representation, jury rights for Englishmen. And then these activities lead to the first really big meeting of the colonies, the Stamp Act Congress, which brought together 27 delegates from 9 different colonies in New York City Hall.
And there's something like extra bad about putting it on newspapers. You know, these are the newspapers that are speaking about what's happening to the people, you know, in ways the British might thought like inciting revolution, all these pieces that it's like doubly destructive. And then, but we keep going. It keeps adding to it, adding to it. We have the Townshend Acts, and then we move into a huge disaster, the Boston Massacre.
Yeah, so the Townshend Acts, they're another new set of taxes in 1767 on imported goods, glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. And so, you know, again, the Parliament's passing these acts to raise money, and again, the colonists are pushing back against them. And here, this time, the British customs officials, the people who are going to collect these taxes, say, British Empire, please protect us. The last time didn't go so well. Can you please do something to protect us? And so the British send 2,000 British troops to America. So by late 1768, there were more than 1,000 British troops in Boston. This represented, at the height of the level of troops, roughly more than a third of Boston's adult male population. So these troops are a pervasive presence on the Boston streets. And for the American colonists put yet another constitutional principle on the table. What's the big principle? No standing armies in times of peace. Colonists fear that these sorts of standing armies like having these British troops on their streets, are a way for governments to impose tyranny. And they thought that the British Empire was basically trying to intimidate them for standing up against them. What ends up being the fallout? It's the famous or infamous Boston Massacre here in March 1770. So it's a crowd of 50, it's a rowdy crowd. They're throwing snowballs, ice, hard objects, pieces of wood at the soldiers, and then shots are fired. 11 colonists are wounded, 5 died on the streets. And there's something interesting that happens afterwards. It's that Governor Thomas Hutchinson, he's in many ways the most famous ally of the British Empire in America. He makes sure that the British soldiers, face justice. They stand before American colonial jury. And who's representing them? Here, it's not a loyalist. It's not a royal official. It's a son of liberty. John Adams is representing the British troops, and this is a powerful moment. John Adams doesn't throw the case. What he's trying to do, he tries to win it. And what he wants to do is he wants to show King George III, Parliament, the royal officials, all the world, that the people of Boston, they're not a lawless mob, and that you can trust American juries to do the right thing. And he largely won the case. And so that's John Adams. That's the Boston Massacre. If we fast forward again to 3.5 years to December 1773, we get the Boston Tea Party. So Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party. What we see is that Parliament gets rid of most of the taxes under the Townshend Acts, but it keeps a tea tax. And so for many of the colonists, they're okay with this. Many of the other colonies, we won on all of these other fronts, fine, tea tax. But the people of Boston say, no, we're going to stand on principle. No taxation without representation means what we said. We stand on constitutional principle, not cheap tea. And so what they end up doing is springing to action, and the Sons of Liberty board these vessels in the Boston harbor. They throw the tea overboard. It's 342 chests of tea that end up in the Boston harbor. And John Adams describes the Boston Tea Party. He calls it, this is the grandest event which has ever yet happened since the controversy with Britain opened. The sublimity of it charms me. In response, the British crack down with an iron fist. They close the Boston harbor. They curb the powers of the town meetings and the Massachusetts General Assembly. They end up taking British soldiers and royal officials, and if they are accused of crimes, they can be tried back in London and not before American colonial juries. The colonists call this the Murder Act, believing that it's going to really let them get away with murder. And then finally, they also pass a new quartering act, which clears the way for more British troops to come to America and also empowered them to house those troops in the homes of American colonists against their will. The hope was that these coercive acts, which the American colonists would call the intolerable acts, would end up dividing Boston, the real rabble-rousers, from the rest of the colonies. Instead, it drew the colonies together and closer to revolution.
And there is a fantastic political cartoon that shows Boston at this time, and it depicts that the Boston people, because the ports are closed, because they're being isolated, are starving. So how can you let your Bostonian brothers in arms starve? So all this, it's unbelievable what's going on in the newspapers at the time. It's one of my favorite ways to teach this is through all these visuals that come in during this time period. Now, Tom, we have like 2 minutes to wrap up really quickly and like 3 really good questions that I'm going to definitely sneak in at the end. But can you kind of lead us to, I think, a document that doesn't, even though we all know its name, I don't think it gets enough attention or enough reading. And I know that Thomas Paine is one of Thomas Donnelly's favorite people to hear about and to read. So Tom, can you tell us a little bit more about Common Sense and how that power that had in that document?
Absolutely. So yeah, the Coercive Acts leads to the First and Second Continental Congresses. We see fighting break out at Lexington and Concord. We see over 1,000 people killed in the Battle of Bunker Hill. And as we get towards the end of 1775, American colonists really have to make a decision. Are we going to remain loyal to the empire, or are we going to go with the Patriots? And there are real divisions. There are close divisions in many places in America. And it's in this context that Thomas Paine's Common Sense hits the colonies like a thunderbolt. It's published in January 1776. What's Paine doing here? Well, he's speaking to the average American colonist. He's not speaking to the elite. And what he's trying to do is boil down some of the highfalutin arguments you might get from James Otis and John Adams and James Wilson and all these great revolutionaries and explain them in a way meant to appeal to the average colonist. I mean, fundamentally, what he's arguing is that Americans must declare independence and become their own free country. But he's doing something bigger than that, too. He's attacking the very idea of monarchy, the very idea of hereditary power. He said, quote, that has laid the world in blood and ashes. He's also placing the revolution in the context of social contract theory, popularizing some of the arguments of John Locke, saying that even taken in basic social contract theory terms, King George III had an obligation under the social contract to protect the happiness and security of Americans, to protect their liberties. He didn't do that. That should then lead the American colonists to break away. But Paine went even further than that. In Paine's view, monarchy itself, the king himself, ran against common sense. We are all born free and equal, so there's that idea of natural rights. And with that, none of us are born to rule, and none of us are born to be ruled. And so in place of a monarchy, Paine's arguing that the colonists should establish republican governments, governments that are powered by the people themselves. And then finally he says, and I have always loved this point, where he said, it just doesn't make sense. It's against common sense that a large continent like America, a growing people, a prosperous people, a dynamic people, should continue to be governed by a tiny island across the sea. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And so what we end up seeing is that Thomas Paine, a lot of what he says there, Curry, then ends up in the Declaration of Independence, is then translated into what we see there as the Americans explain to the world why it is we're fighting a revolution. Is it okay? Can I end on the Declaration, Curry?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So, I mean, with the Declaration, we talked about the opening words and the 3 big principles of popular sovereignty, natural rights, and the rule of law. But there's also a way in which the Declaration is explaining what is it, how was the social contract violated? And what the Declaration says is that the king and the royal officials in Parliament have, quote, engaged in a long train of abuses. What's the British government done? All the things we've already talked about. It imposed taxation without representation, violated the cherished jury rights of the American colonists, sent corrupt and abusive judges and royal officials to America, sent standing armies in times of peace, closed the doors to colonial assemblies, and shut down the American ports. And in the face of all of these abuses, did the king stand up and protect the American colonists as he should under the social contract? No, he didn't stand up to Parliament. He didn't stop the abuses of the royal officials. In fact, he may have even made them worse. And finally, in many ways, the most powerful argument of all is that the king didn't listen. The American people didn't just, one bad thing happen and declare a revolution. They had petitioned the king over and over again, explaining what they took to be the abusive laws that Parliament was imposing, the abusive things the royal officials were doing in America. and the king simply ignored them. And here's the powerful language from the Declaration. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. And so the king and the British Empire itself simply had to go.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tom, for kind of running us through this really quickly. And yes, there are other acts and other pieces that we did not get to, but there are 3 questions afterwards. So for the 3 questions really quickly, I am going to stop the recording